Book 2, Part 9, Chapter 11. I showed Paige the keychain the minute Jonathan finally left the room. The only reason he did leave was because he got a call from my dad. Plus, I think he knew I needed a minute to regroup. When I handed it to her, she shook her head, turning it over and over. "Oh, Raina, it's beautiful, and he made it himself." She said all the right things and then hugged me tightly. I've never seen anything like it. I took it back and smiled down at it. He actually carved our initials in it, just like people do in trees. "But you get to carry this tree with you," she giggled, and I nodded, running my hand over it again. The wood was so smooth, and the coating gave it just a hint of a shine. She tapped the unmarked key. "Maybe that will have to be made to fit the door of the mini manor." I chuckled at the place's nickname, and she shrugged. "It's pretty far away from the city, and his work." "I doubt that will stop him if you really like it." I frowned then, and she shook her head. "Don't do that, Raina. Jonathan is a businessman. They can work from anywhere." When I looked up at her, she nodded. "Look at your dad. All Jonathan needs is an office, a phone, and internet connection, and he can work from anywhere." She squeezed my shoulders caringly. "I am absolutely positive that he would much rather be working from a home where you both are living than any stuffy old office." I chuckled then, and she stepped back, nodding. "I wonder how he's going to convince your father to override the 6-month rule." When I balked, she laughed and grabbed her coat off the chair. "He'll find a way. I'm just wondering how." Then she took my arm and we walked back out into the main room. Jonathan was standing with Michael and Martin, and I noticed the gold keychain in his hand. He was showing it to them. Paige slipped her arm through mine and gave me a small squeeze, walking us closer to the guys. Michael and Martin smiled at me, and Jonathan was beaming. He didn't even slip it into his pocket, and I noticed it already had several keys hanging from it. Yeah, he was a keeper. "Ready?" he asked, and I nodded. He looked at Paige, and she slipped out of my arm and walked towards my bodyguards. Jonathan took my hand, and we stepped into the elevator. When we got to the car, I looked over and noticed the 2 wolf guards. Jack was one of them, but I couldn't remember the other one's name, even though I know I knew it. That bothered me, and I leaned in and whispered to Jonathan. "David," he replied, taking the opportunity to kiss my cheek. I grinned and climbed in the back of Michael's SUV. Jonathan made a comment about needing to get a larger car, and I chuckled. "Why?" He sat on the seat next to me, Paige and Jack across from us. "Because I can't think of a time that you and I will be the only ones in a vehicle." Paige and Jonathan chuckled at the comment, but I bit my lip and turned my head, pretending to adjust myself on the seat. The only time I had ever been in a car without my guards was when I went to Polson with Track. He would always come to the manor and then drive me there in my car. The pain crushed into my chest again as I remembered sitting in the passenger seat, laughing, talking, or just enjoying the ride with my best friend. I needed to talk to him. Track would tell me what was really going on. He would explain the misunderstanding, and then I could get my dad to see reason, and all would be well, right? Why hadn't Track told me before? Why had they all kept me out of Polson? Those questions still haunted me and seemed so out of character for all of them. "Raina?" I looked up slowly, and Jonathan's eyes watched mine. He said they told him so much, so I quickly lowered them, just in case. "It was a bad joke," he whispered, and I shrugged, running a hand absently over the leather seat. "Where's David?" I finally asked to change the mood. "He's staying back to watch the apartment." I nodded and drew in a breath. My hand went up to my shirt, and I started to finger the amulets on my necklace without realizing it. I could smell the wolf in Paige and Jack, and it made me so incredibly homesick. Jack smiled at me, seeming to sense that I needed it, and I gave him a nod and thanked him with my eyes. Jonathan saw a lot in my eyes, but wolves could say a lot to each other with just a look. Jack was giving me support with his. He wasn't part of my pack. He didn't bear any pack mark at all. There were wolves that had no pack allegiance, but they still seemed to group together anyhow. The ones at the manor did just that. We had a few dozen that worked there. Only half of them were from Polson. 3 hours, I thought, as the car moved forward. This is going to be a very long ride. Jonathan turned to me, and I realized I had thought it with the part he could hear. "Well, it is," I thought, but smiled this time, and he chuckled. It actually went pretty fast. Jonathan, being a great host, kept everyone talking and entertained for the trip. I had wanted Paige to be able to sit up front with Michael. I glanced over at Martin and decided I would find a way to make that happen on the way back. We arrived at the mini manor at 10. It had a gate, but no gatehouse. There was an intercom set on a pole on the left side just outside the gate, but the gate was open and we drove through. I sat up then, and Michael had lowered the tinting, but it was still dark out. The driveway was long and flanked by trees and shrubs, though the road was wide enough for 3 cars. When we reached the front of the house, we pulled up onto a circular driveway and stopped at the front stairs. Jack was the first one out, then Paige followed. Jonathan smiled at me and crawled out, turning to give me his hand. When I stepped out, they were all standing in a line, and I looked up. The house was brick with wooden trim and columns by the front door. The stairs were gray, but bright, and I smiled. Then the front door opened, and 2 men in suits walked out, the light from inside flooding the front landing. They were both younger than I expected, Michael's age, maybe. I drew in a breath and nodded. They were both pure vampires. Why didn't that surprise me? The blonde one trotted down to us and smiled at me before turning to Jonathan and offering his hand. "Mr. Hilvar." "Mr. Arcus," Jonathan retorted with a nod and a smile. Then he turned to me. "This is Rena Beldren." The man turned to me, smiling wide. "Yes, it is indeed." I put my hand out, but he took it, turned it over gently, and kissed the back of it. My forehead wrinkled a bit, but he flashed me a salesman's smile and gestured behind him. "My brother and I can't wait to show you this jewel." His brother's hair was a bit darker, what most would call dirty blonde. He was a little taller and a bit older, and he waved from the landing. Jonathan took my hand, and we headed up the stairs, with the others following. The foyer was very nice, although it looked rather sterile without any furnishings. The floors were a soft blue tile with wisps of white. The walls were a slightly darker blue, but the massive chandelier didn't allow the colors to hide the size of the area. I glanced over my shoulder and smiled at Paige, who stood next to Michael. Martin was off to one side, his eyes watching everything. I turned my head one way, then the other, wondering where Jack was. Then Jonathan gave my hand a slight squeeze, and we started our tour. The place was beautiful, and I found myself wandering around in awe. The windows were tinted, but didn't have any day shutters. Seems this house was not vampire ready. I heard the agents and Jonathan discussing what would need to be done, but I took Paige and we walked through the rooms discussing other renovations. The kitchen was amazing and huge. The refrigerator itself looked like a mini closet, and it had dispensers on the outside for ice and water. For some reason, that intrigued me. I stood looking at the device and then reached out and pushed the ice button. A whirring sound came from inside the refrigerator and my brows rose. Then a soft clunk and ice cubes came gushing out and went sliding all over the floor. Paige laughed and I gasped, and then we chased the slippery cubes with Michael's help and tossed them into one of the double sinks. I wiped my hands on my pant legs, thanked them for helping me, and quickly left the room, afraid to touch anything else in it. There was no pool here, but there was a room that could definitely be turned into a game room. It looked like it was meant to be a party ballroom. I shivered at the thought and imagined where the air hockey table would go. We met up with the others and were heading up the stairs, chatting away about what we had seen in our separate tours. Suddenly, a feeling slammed into me. My hand was on the banister and I stopped, turning and looking behind me as my heart began to pound in my chest. A memory began to wash over me, and I had to grip the railing tightly to keep myself steady. I was at the manor, walking up the steps to my room, and Track was standing at the top. His jeans were a bit wrinkled, and his black t-shirt had water spots on it from the rain outside. I smiled up at him, and he winked. "You going to just stand there all day?" I felt a hand on my back, and Track vanished. I gasped, blinking several times, and then turned. Jonathan's worried face was watching me, and I swallowed hard. I didn't offer any explanation and turned, walking quickly up the rest of the stairs. "The master suite is this way," one of the realtors told us, and we followed him down a hallway. I did notice that the colors here were so much brighter than at the manor. My manor was done in rich reds, browns, and greens with cherry wood. This was done in soft tones of blues, whites, and yellows. It was nice, but it just seemed odd. We stopped at a set of large double doors that were off-white with gold latch-type handles. The two agents opened them like doormen, both grinning and watching my face carefully. We stepped in, and I heard Paige gasp softly behind me. We had stepped into a small sitting room. I guess small, only compared to what I was used to. The rug was soft gray, and there was a large fireplace on the far wall. The fireplace was framed in gray brick with a charcoal gray mantle on top of it. There was a huge window on each side that went from knee level almost to the bowed ceiling. "The sleeping room is to the left," one of the brothers stated, and we walked through the room to another set of double doors. These were made of glass, with swirls of gold brushed over them in an elegant pattern. The bowed ceiling in the bedroom made it seem massive. I shivered a bit then. The colors and lack of furniture made it seem colder than it was. The first agent noticed and stopped talking, watching me. Yeah, a vampire that shivers. That stood out. Jonathan let go of my hand and slipped his arm around my waist. "Are you cold?" he barely whispered into my ear. I realized I was, a little. It was an odd sensation. Not like the shivering I did after a shift. The cool air here seemed just a bit uncomfortable, and Jonathan looked around the room. Just then, Paige started to take off her coat. "Here, you can wear mine. I'm fine." "No," I smiled. "It's just a chill. I'm okay." She stopped with hers halfway off, and I shook my head. When she slipped it back on, I stepped up to the closet door and opened it, not wanting the attention. It was a huge walk-in closet with built-in shelves and drawers. Paige stepped in with me and nodded. Very nice. There are 2 closets in this room, I heard one of them telling Jonathan. His and hers, the other chuckled. We moved on to the bathroom, and I did get excited then. The huge sunken tub caught my interest, and I stepped up to it. I'd never had a bathtub. When I was small, I was given a bath in a special-made tub, but after that, it had always been showers. This one was almost shaped like a shell, and was a very soft brown with flecks of creams, blues, and even a tiny hint of pink. And the frame around it was tiled and made a ledge all the way around, except for the side that had 1 step. The tiles were darker than the tub, but mixed with swirls of green, cream, red, and even some blue. It was beautiful. The chrome fixtures were higher than the rim and seemed more like art. It's a jacuzzi tub, the older Mr. Arcus explained, pointing to the screened holes in the side. He showed Jonathan the control panel, and I turned and moved to the shower. It was definitely a walk-in. 1 glass door that opened out, and the inside there was plenty of room for 2. The tiles here matched the tub. 3 of the walls had chrome tubes with shower heads protruding from them at different angles. I tilted my head, and then noticed a small built-in seat. I was impressed. I've never seen a shower like that, Paige whispered, and I nodded. The rest of the tour paled in comparison. The bathroom was my favorite by far. When we ended up in the laundry room, the younger Arcus brother smiled. Now, how about a tour of the grounds? There are 2 carts ready and waiting. Suddenly Michael stepped up next to me, and I shot him a hard look. Jonathan nodded. How about we just take a look at what we can see from here? The younger agent looked confused, but quickly regained himself and opened a back door. I couldn't help but smile when we stepped out. The smells hit me, and I stopped and inhaled deeply. I missed being outside. My eyes closed on their own, and I lifted my head, inhaling deeply. The scent of grass, dirt, and fresh air mingled and greeted me. The lawn was freshly mowed, which only intensified the aroma. I heard the others talking around me, but I ignored them and enjoyed this bit of outside freedom that had become so rare for me. When I did open my eyes, I saw that we were standing on a large deck. I ignored it, walked over to the stairs, and hurried down them. I wanted to be on that lawn. Michael cleared his throat behind me, but I pretended not to notice. It was all I could do not to bend over and kick off my shoes to feel the grass under bare feet. I had to settle for feeling my feet sink into the lush green carpet. I didn't notice the perfect hedges, or the fountain, or the slated path that led somewhere. My eyes lifted and saw the tree line in the distance. I gasped loudly then, putting a hand to my chest. I knew they were not the same trees, and that Poulsen was not just on the other side of them. But just having them there was enough to bring the ache crashing back down. When I took a step forward, my eyes locked on the forest, more than a football field away. Jonathan caught my elbow gently. I gave a low growl and took another step, my heart yearning to run into that forest. I wanted it. I needed it. Something deep inside pulled at me, urging me to go. "Let's go back inside," he whispered, and I shook my head. "No, I'm okay. It's..." Then Michael stepped up on my other side, and snap, the euphoria was gone. I growled deeper then, turned and stomped back towards the house. "Couldn't just let me enjoy something for 1 minute, could you?" I hissed under my breath as I marched through the laundry room and into the hall. Of course they all rushed in and were right behind me. What? Did they think I was going to run away? I turned on them hard, and they came to an abrupt stop. Am I a prisoner here? I wanted to shout, but instead I calmed myself. The mixture of looks on the faces before me ranged from concern to astonishment. I'm sure the two agents were wondering if it would be safe to whisper about this to a few close friends. I didn't care. The feeling had resurfaced, and I felt a pang of loneliness that made my chest rise and fall and my eyes water. I turned away quickly, drew in a slow breath, and looked down at my shaking hands. Jonathan was talking to the realtors, and Paige stepped up cautiously to my side. I nodded and gave a small smile. I'm okay. She nodded back, and I saw her arm flinch just a little, wanting to reach out and comfort me, but not sure how I would react. I longed to feel the comfort of a wolf. I needed it badly now, but it wasn't her I needed it from. The harshness of the thought snapped my head up. Paige was a friend, and a good one at that. As if to atone for my unknown thoughts, I reached out and took her hand. She looked down at mine, but didn't comment on the fact it was still shaking, just a little. Her touch did help, and I inhaled her scent, forcing myself to calm and find comfort in the wolf in her. I did jump slightly when Jonathan walked over on my other side and put his hand on my back. He frowned, and I reluctantly let go of Paige's hand so I could wrap my arm around his waist without pulling her. So, what do you think? He asked, trying to smile. It has the best bathroom I have ever seen, I chuckled, trying to sound enthusiastic. He nodded, still looking too worried. I gave him the I'm fine, don't worry so much look, and his smile widened a bit. When he turned us towards the door, the agents reanimated and followed along, explaining other aspects of the house and grounds. Most were things that, to be honest, I didn't really understand or care about. They went on about the foundation, structure reinforcement for things like earthquakes, and anti-mold drywall. Jonathan threw out questions that showed he not only got what they were saying, but that he knew a thing or two about real estate. Again, I was impressed, and again, I felt a little less than adequate at his side. We didn't stop at the foyer, and we were down the stairs with the two talking feverishly to Jonathan, as if they were afraid they would never see us again unless they had an answer right now. As Michael opened the door, the older one made a last attempt by acting like he was telling us a secret. We have 2 other people here looking at this place. Just this week, we had 2 other people. His counterpart nodded but smiled. But they have not made a firm offer, and, well, he smiled at both of us in turn. We would certainly rather see it be a first home for such a wonderful couple. I had to cough to hide my laugh, but Jonathan did chuckle out loud. Well, we aren't making any decisions tonight. We have a list of other places that we'll be looking at. He glanced up at the structure, pretending not to see the worried glance the Arcus brothers gave each other. You're in the business of selling property. If you get a good offer... Oh, Mr. Hilvar, the younger one put in, his eyes wide. We would hold off on any offer until we heard from you, if you are at all interested in it. My brows rose then. Were they serious? I looked at my boyfriend and wondered just how much rank he really had. That is, we could hold off for a limited time, the older one stated, wringing his hands nervously. I do hope you understand. Of course, business is business, Jonathan stated, and then gave a long pause. Looking the front of the manor over again, he furrowed his brows. It would need an awful lot of work to make it ready to even move in, he glanced at them. The shutter system at least. Then I saw you eye the color. And I'm not happy with a couple of other things." I saw the mischievous twinkle in his eye, and I bit my cheek and nodded. "Then there's that kitchen tile." He nodded again, then shook his head and wrinkled his brow a bit, as if he was no longer impressed with the building. The Arcus brothers looked ready to faint on the spot. The older one stepped up. "Mr. Hilvar, if you could give us a list of your issues, I will address them with the current owners as well as get some immediate estimates on pre-work." Professional realtor or not, he could not hide the panic. This place was beautiful and wouldn't be hard to sell, so it had to be their desire to have Jonathan be the one to buy it. Just how powerful was my betrothed? Jonathan turned and appeared to be giving the front area a once-over again, but I think he was just enjoying his game. He turned back and shrugged. "We'll fax you a list tomorrow. I'll give you 3 days to come back with replies to it all, and then—" He looked at me, and I got lost in his intense stare. Something about seeing him playing this game made my heart quicken. "We'll see if she wants it or not," he replied to them, but kept his eyes locked on mine. There went those butterflies again. The men rambled on as Jonathan helped me in the car, where I smiled at Paige, who was covering her mouth to keep from laughing. Finally, Jonathan slid in and the door was closed, Michael's massive form now creating a wall between us and them. Suddenly, I realized that Paige was back here, not up front. I gasped, and Jonathan looked at me. I turned to him, and he winked at me and told Michael to hold on. Then Jonathan glanced at Paige. "Would you mind terribly sitting up front for the ride? I have business to discuss with Martin and Jack here." When her face turned several shades of red, Jonathan laughed. "Really now, I had them look over some things at the manor, and I'd like to get their reports." She nodded, and Martin quickly got out of the front seat and came to open her door. I smiled at her as she stepped out and then wiggled up next to Jonathan as Martin slipped in. He did ask Martin and Jack a few dozen questions as we left, stretching them out and asking them in a slightly different way. I even threw out a few, after seeing the look Michael gave me in the rearview mirror. "Hey, we were on their side." Finally, Jonathan leaned back, pulling me close to him. He kissed the top of my head and asked how I really liked the place. I chewed my lip for a minute, then shook my head, keeping my eyes down. "It's too far away from the city." He laughed hard then, not the reaction I had expected, and I looked up at him confused. "Is that the only thing you have against it?" he smiled. I shrugged. "Well, like you said, it needs a lot done to it, expensive things, before it could even be lived in." The smile slipped a little, and he gave me one of those looks that said, "Are you done trying to come up with excuses yet?" I rolled my eyes and laid my head back on his shoulder. "It's nice enough, I guess," I finally stated, holding back my grin. Truth was, I loved it. "Ah, I see," he replied, his voice playful. "Well, we still have a list of other places we can look at. We can see one each night, and then you can decide." Me? Why was it all my decision? I shrugged in his arms. "And what if I don't like any of them?" He laid his cheek on my head. "Then we will keep looking." There was a small twinge of fear that someone else would come and take that bathroom away from me, but pride kept my mouth shut. I had actually closed my eyes and started to nod off when Jonathan's phone went off. I gasped and sat up quickly. He chuckled as he pulled his phone out and looked down at the screen. He held it so I could see, too, and I saw my dad's name. "Hello, sir," Jonathan stated, smiling at me. I turned sideways on the seat and propped one elbow against the back. "We just came from there." Then he proceeded to talk real estate with my dad. It had nothing to do with the bathroom at all, So I moved down more and laid on the seat, my legs bent over the edge. It wasn't at all comfortable, but I wasn't going to lay my head in his lap, not in a car full of people. The conversation droned, and I drifted again. As soon as I fell asleep, the smells hit me. Damp grass, decaying trees, fresh dirt. In my dream, I lifted my head and inhaled slowly, smiling. Then I did what I couldn't do at the house. I sat down, took off my shoes and socks, and walked through the plush green carpet. I wasn't at the mini manor, and not even at home. I was just in a large open field with a forest that banked one side so close that the night shadow of the trees covered me. I could turn and look through the sentries, seeing glimpses of the dark world there. I walked alongside it, stopping to wiggle my toes in the grass. At one point, I knelt down, running my hand through the soft blades. Something moved just inside the trees, and I stood up quickly, turned, and watched. I wasn't afraid, but I was cautious. After a few minutes, I picked up my shoes and socks and carried them lazily in one hand as I continued my wonderful walk. There didn't seem an end to my grassy sidewalk, and the forest would stay just to my right. I had nearly forgotten about the movement when I saw it again, this time with a slight rustling sound. I stopped and turned, facing the woods and peering into them. Again, I was not afraid, simply curious. When I lifted my nose and inhaled, my eyes widened. I knew that smell. It was the smell of the wolves, of my wolves. I bounced excitedly and called out to the trees, then waited. There was no reply. I called out again, letting my eyes scan what little I could see through the trees. Silence. Finally, I took a step in that direction, peering from side to side as I did. Just as my foot was about to cross the edge of the grass, I felt something pulling me from behind. I gasped and looked over my shoulder, but there was no one there. It felt as if arms had wrapped around my stomach and were pulling me backwards. It took a second for me to react, and then I tried to break away, twisting and turning and trying to pull myself in the opposite direction. Whatever had me was strong, though. For every step I made towards that forest, it was able to pull me back 3. I saw the tree line getting farther away. Panic swept over me, and I called out again, nearly screaming for my pack to save me. Suddenly, the invisible hands pulled again, harder than before, and my vision blurred, everything turning to darkness as the forest faded away. "No!" I screamed, still lashing out. "No, please, I'm right here. Raina, wake up." I froze then, blinking hard and ignoring the pounding in my chest. When I opened my eyes, Jonathan was leaning over me, his face once again filled with worry. I frowned. I put that look on his face a lot. His gray eyes smiled at me. "It was just another dream," he cooed, reaching up and wiping the hair out of my face. I turned my head and saw Martin, who was talking over the front seat with Michael or Paige, and Jack was looking out the window. Great. Another nightmare where I end up screaming like a lunatic. How quaint. Jonathan moved when I went to sit up, and I finished brushing the hair out of my own face. Martin turned back, and I ignored him. I also ignored the stare I could feel coming from the rearview mirror. Sighing, I turned and sat properly in the seat, leaning my head back as my heart slowed to a normal pace. Well, normal for me, right now. Jonathan's phone rang, and I had to chuckle. He ignored it until it went quiet, but I didn't look at him either. I kept my eyes on the dark fabric of the ceiling, afraid to let my mind wander back to the dream, but also not wanting to talk about it. His phone rang again, and he grumbled as he pulled it out and looked at the screen. "How long until we're back at the apartment?" I asked. Jack and Jonathan turned a bit and started to I asked Jack, and Jonathan turned a bit and started to punch buttons on his fancy phone. "We'll be home in about 30 minutes, Jonathan replied, not looking up. Jack nodded, and I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. I heard his phone give one beep a few minutes later, but kept my eyes closed. The soft clicking of keys finally got my attention, and I half opened one and turned a bit towards him. He was bent over the device, using both thumbs to type out his message with a speed that was impressive. When I gave a soft sigh, he turned, and I opened both eyes and smiled at him. For some reason, he looked ruffled. At least his face did. I frowned. I really had to get better control over myself. I was wearing him out, and it was finally starting to show. He leaned over and kissed my temple, then whispered in my ear, "You'll sleep in my room tonight." My eyes widened. The sudden vision of Aunt Mary storming through his bedroom door popped into my head. He winked at me. "I have work to do tonight, so I won't be sleeping." "Oh." He took his arm, slipped it under me, and pulled me towards him. "There's a door from my office to my bedroom. I'll hold you until you are asleep, then I'll work in the study." "Why?" "I have some things I need to get caught up on." "No, not that," I replied, sitting up but staying close to him. "Why do I need to sleep in your bed, then?" He motioned with his chin to the front of the car. "Then Paige can have your nice bed, and you can have my large one, and I won't feel so guilty for both of you sharing that small room." I rolled my eyes, and he nodded. "So, see? You'd be doing me a favor." That made me chuckle. And wanting to keep an eye on me in case I have any more dreams wouldn't have anything to do with it? Of course it would. He gave me another small squeeze. Wasn't sure how I felt about that answer, but at least it was honest. When he finally pulled into the garage, I sat forward and twisted a bit. Being in the car for so long did take its toll. Martin and Jack hopped out, and I saw David walk over as I stepped out. I inhaled and smiled. The wolf scent was stronger on him and Jack than on Paige. They looked at me and gave a nod, a smile only in their eyes. Once we were inside, Paige headed to the shower in our room, and I did the same in the larger bathroom in Jonathan's room. It wasn't as fancy as the one at the Mini Manor, but he did have a special hot water tank set up for it, like at home. He didn't have a special hot water tank set up for it like the one at home, so my shower was quick. I saw Wolfie on the pillows of his bed when I came out, and then noticed a door that was open in the corner. Had that always been there? Jonathan walked through, and I tilted my head. He turned and closed it behind him, and I was amazed to see that it completely blended in with the wall. "Impressive," I smiled. He chuckled. "I'm glad you approve." I walked over and crawled into the bed. The soft sheets and mattress made me smile and sigh as I slid in. He crawled up behind me, pulling the covers down a bit and then laying down next to me. I moved over closer and laid my head on his shoulder. Even with the small nap in the car, I was exhausted and fell asleep almost immediately. This time, I slept without dreams. When I opened my eyes, I heard the faint clicking of computer keys, and I turned towards the hidden door that was halfway open. I listened as he talked quietly to someone. Since I didn't hear any response, I figured he must be on the phone. I rolled quietly over the other way. hugging Wolfie to me and enjoying the quiet moment without someone, even a wonderful someone, hovering over me. Then my brows rose a bit as I looked at the phone that sat in its cradle next to the clock. I bit my lower lip and wondered if Jonathan was on the landline or on his cell phone. I pulled my arm out of the covers, still not sure if I was brave enough to chance it. Sneaking hadn't worked so well for me before, no matter how noble the reason. Finally awake? I froze, guilt rising up even though my hand was still resting on the covers. I turned and smiled at Jonathan as he walked around the bed and sat on my side. You didn't have to stop working, I smiled, sitting up and pushing the hair out of my face. Yes, I did, he smiled. I've been at it all day. I frowned. Since we went to sleep? When he nodded, my frown deepened, and he leaned forward to kiss me. You keep me from being a workaholic now. Were you before? He nodded again, and I shook my head. You and my dad. I just don't get that. I'm glad you don't, he smiled. And then his cell phone rang from the other room. When he ignored it and kept his eyes on me, I looked at the clock. It's 6 p.m. I slept too long. Says who? He chuckled, and I shrugged. I guess he was right. Your father called. Twice. Oh? He just wanted to check on you. Make sure I'm not causing any more wars, I grumbled, then shook my head. Great. Another attitude was creeping in. There was a knock on the door, and we both turned. Jonathan called out, and Martin replied, There's an unscheduled visitor downstairs. Jonathan stood and went to the door. Who is it? A Mr. Domwell, Martin said in a tight, irritated voice. Jonathan sighed. He's my cousin. There was a moment of silence, and he looked back over at me. I'll go down and see what he wants. Money, usually. I'll be right back. I nodded and watched him leave. When I pushed off the covers and sat on the edge of the bed, I looked at the phone again. Maybe if I just called Track. My hand reached for it. Slowly, part of me feeling like a child about to do something very wrong. But what was so wrong about it? Track was my friend, my best friend. If I could talk to him, he could talk to Ryan, and we could fix this whole mess. I was sure of it. He would explain how my dad had misunderstood, and we would laugh about it. I smiled as I reached out further, my hands inches from the receiver. I swallowed hard. This wasn't like last time. I would be helping, not making it worse. Finally, I snatched the phone, then pulled it to my lap, quickly looking at the door. Then I turned it over, staring at the number panel. With a nod, I punched Track's number in and put it to my ear, my heart beating madly. It didn't ring. I hung it up and tried again. No dial tone. Nothing, just silence. That ticked me off, and I slammed it back into the holder and stood up. I remembered Jonathan's cell phone then, and I hurried into his study. He had a handful of files laid across the deep wood desk. His computer screen was up with a spreadsheet that I barely looked at. The cell phone was next to the keyboard, and I took a few steps towards it. Just as I reached for it, Michael walked in. I yelped and jumped. His brows rose, and I growled, "Don't scare me like that." I went into the room, but you weren't there. Obviously, I snapped. He ignored my attitude and glanced down at the phone. I followed his eyes. Jonathan said my dad called twice for me. Then I lifted my chin. It seems I can't use the house phone, so I thought I would use his cell, since no one seems to want me to have my own anymore. I threw out the last part and snatched Jonathan's cell phone up. Michael crossed his arms, and I quickly lost my anger. Man, he was good at that. I shrugged. Well, why doesn't the regular phone work? I asked, although it came out more as a whine. Do you need to ask? He chuckled, and that got my hackles back up. Actually, I do. It's stupid. What if I needed to make a call? What if there was an emergency? Okay, that was a stupid thing to say to my enormous, nearly immortal bodyguard. He kept looking at me like he had just caught me doing something wrong. So what if you had? I grumbled something, sat the phone down, and stomped past him back into the bedroom. I walked through the other door and down the hallway to my room. Paige wasn't in there, so I grabbed some clothes and went into the shower. Yes, I had one just before I went to bed, but it was the only place I could be alone. The hot shower helped calm me down a bit, and I was a little less irritated as I got dressed. When I walked out, I heard Jonathan and someone else talking down the hall. I tossed my pajamas into the basket and followed the sound. My boyfriend and the stranger were standing at the end of the hall, and they both turned as I approached. The blonde newcomer smiled wide. Jonathan didn't. Hello, I said quietly, looking between them. There was a slight family resemblance. Same colored eyes was the most obvious. This must be the cousin. He stood about 2 inches shorter, but was solid and handsome with his dark hair that was cut short. Raina, this is my cousin, Brent Domwell, Jonathan stated, reaching out and taking my hand. His cousin beamed. Raina Beldrin, amazing, he laughed, and then grabbed me and pulled me into a hug. I gasped, and my arm stayed behind me in Jonathan's grip. When Brent let go, he was still grinning. You really are as beautiful as rumors say. For whatever reason, I smiled. There was something about his smile that didn't let you do anything else. I inhaled then, out of reflex. All vampire, too. His gray eyes sparkled with playful mischief, and I felt a giggle in my throat. Jonathan cleared his, and I blinked, then turned. Did Brent try to use persuasion on me? It was impossible, but why did I feel almost giddy when he looked at me? I stepped up closer to my boyfriend, and he put his arm around my waist protectively. Like I said, Brent, I have a full house already. Yeah, I can see that, his cousin replied. I could feel his smile where I stood, even though I was looking away now. I heard another voice in the living room, and my eyes widened. Jonathan grinned at me, and I let go of his hand and rushed into the main room. Allison and Joel were sitting on the couch with Paige, and I rushed over as she stood. Allison, I cried out, grabbed her and hugged her tightly, then stepped back and smiled. Why didn't they tell me you were here? I was so happy to see her. A friendly face in the midst of, well, all this. You were in the shower when we got here, she explained, smiling back. I shrugged, then turned to Joel and said hello. He returned the greeting, and I told them to sit back down, taking a seat next to Allison. Now I really did feel giddy and couldn't stop smiling. How are you doing? She asked, still smiling back, but I saw the concern in her blue eyes. I shrugged lightly. Not too bad, I guess. Man, it was good to see her. We all turned as Jonathan and Brent walked into the room. Brent walked lightly, that impish but compelling smile on his handsome face, and Jonathan looked extremely irritated. Brent chuckled. I didn't think this little apartment could hold any more, cousin. He wore expensive jeans and a leather jacket over a deep blue shirt. He was extremely good-looking, and his light, fun air only added to that. I felt his stare and turned to Allison. How long are you staying? Before she could answer, Brett stepped up, eyeing my chest. I frowned, and then he whistled. They really do have you wired. I balked and then looked down, my tracking device hanging outside of my shirt. I lifted it, glancing at the two charms, and crammed it under my top quickly. He looked up at me, his eyes softer, and his voice almost a whisper. That must suck. Normally that would make me mad, but his eyes told me that he felt for me. I sighed softly, and Jonathan stepped up. It's to keep her safe, he hissed, trying to control his voice. Brent shook his head, his eyes still on mine. A room full of bodyguards, an apartment wired better than Area 51, and she has to wear a bell. He shook his head, his eyes softening a bit more. That's not right, cuz. I bit my lower lip and my eyes watered. He did understand. He didn't make me feel ashamed or embarrassed, and he wasn't trying to tease me either. He looked angry about it, and I couldn't seem to look away. I saw my own eyes reflected in his, and my heart jumped a bit. Jonathan took my hand and pulled me up to him. I blinked and frowned a bit. "Knock it off, Brent," I heard him hiss, and then I shook my head. Maybe his cousin had learned to use persuasion on other vampires. Or, I thought, maybe there isn't enough vampire left in me. That thought hit me hard, and I actually gasped. Jonathan thought we could all go see a movie, Allison put in quickly, and I looked at her, the fear still floating on the surface. What if I was becoming less of a vampire? Was it possible? I frowned and then felt a soft squeeze on my hand. I glanced down and then up at Jonathan. He smiled. A special preview of a movie that isn't quite out yet. I tilted my head, still too absorbed to understand. I tried to remember the things I had heard my doctors whispering about. Doctors? I looked around the room. That's what was missing. Why hadn't any of the doctors come? They had shadowed me since my shifting began. I wrinkled my brow. How odd I hadn't noticed it until right now. Suddenly, Jack stepped up. I could smell him before I saw him, and I turned. I locked my eyes on his, and he gave a very small nod. The panic slowed a bit, and I inhaled deeply, taking in his wolf scent. Why did I need that so much right now? Only his eyes moved, then the slightest twitch of his mouth, and I relaxed. This wasn't the time. He was right. I squared my shoulders, gave him the same almost non-existent nod, and turned back to Jonathan, feeling a little stronger. What movie? His eyes widened, and he told me the name. I had heard about it, and he was right. It wasn't due in the theaters for another week. Pulled some of those strings, huh? I smiled, and ignored the confused look on his face. I turned back to Allison, my eyes barely meeting Jack's as they passed him. I've heard it's supposed to be incredible, and so much better than the book. Her blue eyes watched me for a split second, but Joel nodded, stepping up next to her, which is rare. Usually when they turn a book into a movie, they slaughter it. I nodded at him, and we quickly named off a handful of movies that had done just that. Allison and Paige threw in a few too. Jack stayed in the room, and my wolf senses knew exactly where he was, and felt comforted by it. When I asked Jonathan when we would need to leave, he said we had about an hour. I smiled and grabbed Allison and Paige, announcing we were going to our room. Joel smiled, Jonathan tried to, and Brent winked at me as we left. We flopped on my bed and started talking about girl things. It felt so good to have them both here. Paige was like an older sister, smart, protective, and in control. Allison was happy, fun, positive, and like a burst of color and sound in this all-male place. I smiled the whole time we talked, feeling tension and stress lightening. Allison announced the union date for her and Joel, 6 months and 1 week from now. "Have you and Jonathan picked a date?" she asked, sitting cross-legged in front of me on the bed. I shrugged. "No, but he swears he's going to get our dads to ignore vampire tradition and let us union earlier." She giggled, and I did too. Man, I was glad she was here. Allison was always happy, but not in an annoying way. "I have no doubt that Jonathan can talk them into bending the rules," she grinned, then leaned in towards Paige and I. "Wouldn't you love to listen in on that conversation?" We all laughed, and then she turned to Paige. "So, are you and Michael still pretending you don't notice each other?" Poor Paige. Blushing made it impossible to pretend. I smiled and nodded. "Yeah, but we're making it harder for them." "Good," she chuckled, giving Paige a friendly smile and patting her knee sincerely. "You two are amazing together, Paige. Really." Allison shook her head. We nothing. Love is love. There's absolutely no reason you shouldn't be just as happy as Raina and I are. Now, you listen to me, and we will have you two planning your own party in a month." I covered my mouth, laughing, as Allison leaned over and started to whisper. She was amazing, and definitely knew more about this game than I did. Obviously, more than Paige did, too. Poor Paige looked ready to faint at first, but finally relaxed and started to confess how she felt about my bodyguard. Allison and I listened intently, sighing and smiling in all the right places. She opened up and looked so relieved to be saying it all out loud. When someone finally knocked on the door, we stiffened and went silent like we had been caught doing something wrong. Allison recovered the fastest and called out. Jonathan opened the door and looked us over. His eyes took in our sheepish grins, and he shook his head. "Why am I suddenly afraid?" he whispered, although his eyes were twinkling. We giggled and stood up when he announced that the cars were ready. Allison snuck Paige a quick wink and chuckled, and I headed out the door, smiling at Jonathan as I went. He shook his head again, grinning and pretending not to notice how flushed Paige was when she stepped up. I was surprised to see Brent still in the living room and looked at Jonathan, who gave an irritated shrug. I felt Brent watching, but ignored it. My eyes were searching for Jack. His thick wolf scent helped calm me, and for whatever reason, it didn't make me as antsy. It didn't take much to make me antsy lately. He wasn't in the apartment, and I felt my skin quiver as I looked around. Jonathan put his hand on my back, and we stepped into the elevator. Allison and Joel started a conversation, but I really didn't hear it. When we reached the garage, I felt a small pang of panic as I looked around. Jack and David weren't here. Why that bothered me so much, I don't know, but it did. My heart rate went up a bit, and my muscles twitched. Where were they? Jonathan walked me to the SUV. I took one more look around, and then climbed in and sat down. Jonathan sat next to me, and Brent shot me a smile just before he sat on the seat directly across from me. Joel sat next to him, and Allison climbed in last. I smiled wide as Martin stuck his head in and explained that he and David would be following in another car. That part didn't make me smile, but seeing Paige slide into the front passenger seat did. She turned and gave me a quick grin, her cheeks red but her eyes happy. The door was shut, and Brent leaned back, propping an elbow on the back of the seat. "Is this how you always ride?" When I shrugged, he nodded. "Impressive." Again I smiled when I should have been mad. Jonathan's phone rang, and I frowned as he pulled it out and looked at it, but he pushed a button and shoved it back in his pants pocket. "When am I getting my phone?" I asked bravely, or at least pretending to be brave. "It's at my office," he replied, not looking at me. I nodded and turned away. Figures. "Aren't we going past there tonight?" Brent asked, and I turned, looking at him. He smiled at me and then looked at Jonathan. "The theater is what, 4 blocks from there?" I looked at Jonathan and saw his jaw twitch. Why didn't he want me to have my phone? Okay, that answer was obvious, but still, it stung. "We have no time. They're holding the show for us," Jonathan stated, shooting a hard stare at his cousin. Brent shrugged. "We could always stop after. It's not like your office closes at a certain time." He chuckled. "Even if it did, you're the boss, remember?" He gave another chuckle then, shooting another smile my way. Jonathan felt us all watching him, and he finally gave a sharp nod. I frowned and went to say something, but stopped. I wanted my phone. As I turned to look out the window, I shot his cousin a quick thank you smile and got a wink back. The movie was great. We had the entire theater to ourselves, and this time they did a fairly decent job putting a well-known book onto the screen. I laughed so hard my side ached, and I had to wipe a few tears away at others. Allison and Joel were snuggled up next together. Jonathan had his arm around my shoulder, and I was leaning on his. I had insisted that Michael sit, not stand, and Paige was sitting near the door with him. Brent was on my other side, and admitted that he was impressed with the movie as well. When the credits started to roll and the lights came back on, we all stood and made our way into the lobby. We were busy discussing the movie and laughing amongst ourselves when Michael stepped up and announced the cars were ready. We nodded and continued our playful argument about which part was best as we headed out the doors. "It has to be the part where he confessed to his family at the dinner table," Brent announced, and Allison and I agreed. Joel shook his head. "That was good. But the car going off that cliff?" He shook his head. "The graphics were amazing." I smiled and climbed in the car, feeling happy and enjoying my friends. We sat in the same seats and continued our discussion as the car pulled away. Joel and Jonathan kept commenting on the graphics and special effects, while Brent sided with me and Allison on the actors' abilities. As we rounded a corner, Brett looked out the window. "Did we miss the turn to your office?" The laughing stopped and my smile froze on my face. Jonathan glared at his cousin and then glanced up at the front of the car. I saw Michael give a hard nod, and my boyfriend slid the smile back on his face, winking at me. "We're going around the back, to the private entrance." I nodded, not wanting to ruin the fun we were all having. Allison shook her head. "Oh, but the way he looked at her when they were talking by the bridge," she sighed, smiling, with her hand on her chest. I grinned. That was amazing. Jonathan's brows rose. "Did we see the same movie?" he asked playfully. True enough, he and Joel were retelling the car chases, the crashes, and the explosions, while Allison and I might as well have seen a totally different movie as we talked about the romance, the torn lovers, and the connection between the characters. Brent bounced between both conversations, but sided with us girls when it came to the emotional parts. Jonathan laughed at one point, pulling his phone out and dialing. "We'll be there in about a minute," he said into it, and then hung up. That was a short conversation. True enough, about a minute later, we turned down a road that was only wide enough for the SUV. If another car had been coming towards us, it would have had to back out. Next, we rode through a large door into a fancy garage that would be better described as a car lobby. We pulled up next to a raised platform that was carpeted in deep blue. The cement was spotless, and the lights along the wall were bright and inviting. There were tall plants on either side of a large oak door, where two men stood. They wore deep gray suits with black shirts and ties. They looked a little less scary than Michael and Martin, but not much. Another man stood with them, some sort of book-type thing propped in one arm, a cell phone in his hand, and a harried look on his pale face. I inhaled as we stepped out. All vampires. Then a woman stepped up, and I looked around to see where she came from. Her reddish blonde hair was back in a soft but businesslike bun, with just one curl over her left temple. Her arms were empty, and her hazel eyes took in everything, even as they smiled. She wore a charcoal suit with a skirt, and looked high fashion and extremely professional at the same time. She was older than all of us, but she was beautiful, and when she smiled at me, I couldn't help but smile back. I knew who she was immediately. Everything about her said she was in charge, even if the men here thought otherwise. "Rena, this is my personal assistant. Stacy Mills," I finished for Jonathan, who chuckled and nodded. She stepped up, and her smile widened. "I was wondering when we would finally get the chance to meet you. I was worried Mr. Hilvar was going to keep you to himself forever." She winked, and I giggled, partly at hearing her call him Mr. Hilvar, and partly because she seemed so motherly I couldn't help myself. Jonathan put his hand on my back and then gestured to the other man. "This is Chester. He is Stacy's assistant," he ended with a shrug. The man nearly dropped the object as he shoved it under one arm and held out a hand. I smiled and took it. "It is a great pleasure to meet you, Miss Beltran," he stated, in a slightly shaking voice. I imagine him always being a little frazzled. I shook his hand, and then Stacy nodded to one of the big men, who turned and opened the door. Jonathan walked me through it, and I smiled as we stepped into a very large, very elegant greeting area. It was nearly as fancy as the one at my dad's office. The greeter's desk was dark polished wood and was high enough to hide any work equipment on the other side. I looked at the front of it and saw the gold embossed sign that simply said, Hilvar Corporation. When I looked at Jonathan, he chuckled and turned to the others. "So, do you want a quick tour?" Joel shrugged. "I've been here plenty of times, but if the girls want to." Allison nodded eagerly, and I smiled again. Michael, of course, was talking to the scary guys, and Martin was watching everything at once. Secret Service overkill. I sighed and then let Jonathan lead me through another set of doors. Sally pointed out things to us, and Chester kept hitting buttons on what I realized was a computer tablet in his arms. When his phone rang, he again had to juggle to answer it. Poor Chester either needed an assistant of his own or a nice long vacation. That's where I'm going to stop.